Hello everyone, this is Tom Fox and I'd like to welcome you to episode 153 of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. Today I wanted to take a look at some of the things that a compliance practitioner can do in an economic downturn. Here in Houston, the price of oil has dropped dramatically and that has led to some across-the-board cuts in many companies, including the compliance function. And I wanted to visit with you about some of the things that you can do when you actually have less resources in a compliance program going forward. This episode comes in at just over 22 minutes and I hope you enjoy it. Thank you very much for listening. Hello everyone, this is Tom Fox and I would like to welcome you to this episode of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. Today I thought I would visit with you about some of the things that you can do in an economic turndown if you're in the compliance perspective, compliance department, a chief compliance officer, or a compliance practitioner. I practice in Houston, Texas, so this has obviously been on my mind for a large part of 2015. The layoffs have started and unfortunately they're in full swing here, so everybody's got cut, including the compliance function. That has led me to start to think about what can you do in response to that and how can you do it. I would start by noting that I don't think the Department of Justice is going to have much sympathy for companies who randomly cut the compliance function in an economic downturn. So say your business is off 15, 20, or 25%. If across the board cuts are made on home office overhead, which compliance is as a non-revenue function generally falls into that, if you're cut in that amount without any real analysis by the company on what the value that compliance brings, particularly if you're in a industry that is recognized as high risk or you're in an industry where there's been significant enforcement actions, I don't think the DOJ is going to take kindly on that. And in fact, what I think the Department of Justice may do is resweep the energy industry for that very reason, because of the dramatic cuts that are being made, sometimes as high as 30% of the workforce is going. So that led me to think about and talk to lots of different people about what you can do in an economic downturn. In any economic downturn, and particularly here in Houston in the energy space, we've seen a couple of things happen, and unfortunately I've seen more than one of these, and they seem to follow a pattern. In the first and second quarter of the downturn, which we are now in Q2 here in 2015, you have pretty dramatic cuts. It's just across the board cutting phase. This can mean the loss of personnel, your headcount, loss of resources, even if it was calculated last summer in 2014 when you started your budgeting process. This means that you're going to need to get through a quarter or two where financial resources will really be at a premium and you may have lost some. Normally, I would advocate that the compliance function work with other functions in a corporate home office, such as HR, human resources, IT, internal audit, and marketing for support. But frankly, those functions have probably been right-sized as well, so they may not be able to assist the compliance function as much as they had done previously or as much as you might want them to do. So what are some of the responses you could make? Well, I think the first thing you can do is really implement what my good friend, the CCO at Dresser Rand, Jan Farley, often says, which is don't sweat the small compliance stuff. Jan talks about the need not to waste your scarce compliance resources on areas or matters that are really low risk to your company. And this may be a particularly important time for you to do so. What this means is that you should really focus on what are your highest risks at this point. Now, I understand that this may mean you cannot manage or put risk management around as many risks as you previously did. But if you take a look at your risks, do a risk assessment, and I'll get to doing the risk assessment in a minute. But if you do a risk assessment and reprioritize or refocus your risk management strategy, then you may be able to present that to the Department of Justice or Securities and Exchange Commission if they come knocking. Of course, the key in any of this is to have a reasoned, well thought out plan. And that reasoned, well thought out plan must be documented in a way that shows what your analysis was, how you came to that analysis, what your underlying facts and assumptions were, and then from there, what your implementation plan is or was, and are you actually implementing that plan going forward? So it's the process that is as important, I think, certainly for presentation to the regulators, because with the Department of Justice and Securities and Exchange Commission, it really doesn't matter what you did or what you told them you do. If you didn't document it so that you can present it to them in writing, in their mind it may not have existed. So with that, really start with a risk assessment. Now, when a compliance practitioner or a chief compliance officer hears the word risk assessment, we obviously have a pretty good idea in our head what that may be. But what I would ask you to think about is the following. Instead of hiring a top 3 accounting firm or a big law firm to do your risk assessment, you as the compliance practitioner do that risk assessment. You have worked with hopefully some of the best compliance outside lawyers around, whether that was to help implement or enhance your program. You have studied, you're obviously listening to this podcast, or at least I hope you're listening to this podcast. You may have attended a webinar I put on or a talk I gave on. But at this point, you're probably competent enough to look at your company's risks. Now, I understand as a compliance practitioner, you may be a lawyer, you may be from internal audit, but chances are you're not a forensic auditor. I'm certainly not. I'm a lawyer. So I don't feel competent to do an audit, but I'm not asking you or suggesting that you do an audit. I'm suggesting that you do a risk assessment and assess your highest risks for your company. So take a look at your sales model. Do you use third parties? If so, can you bring your more scarce resources to bear on third parties? If it's through employees, can you bring your scarce resources to bear on managing your your employees who may be involved in sales efforts? Targeted training, additional review of expense reports, lots of different things you can do that you may not have done previously because you may not have had to. So the management of your sales chain risk may be one area that you could take a look at and see what you might be able to do a little more effectively and a little more efficiently going forward. But there's some other things you can do. If you have read anything I've written recently or heard any podcasts, you know I've been thinking, writing, and talking a lot about internal controls. And the internal controls that are a part of the accounting provisions to the FCPA, and how the SEC will probably start looking more closely at companies' internal controls. Obviously, we have the COSO framework in place, and I think that's an appropriate framework for compliance internal controls as well. But what you might be able to do is map the accounting internal controls that you currently have in place to a compliance internal control. So let me give you a couple of examples. First of which is employee expense reports. Everyone requires employees to document their expenses. Most companies will allow an employee to expend certain amounts of money under a certain limit without pre-approval. And in that process, they then have to fill out a form. They have to identify location, where the money was spent, how it was spent, who it was spent for, the amount spent, and then they need to sign their employee expense report. Well, that signature is an internal control. It may not be much, but it's a stop and think control, as Henry Mixon would say. So your employee expense reporting system is an internal control. Of course, it's focused on accounting and accounts payable and your finance folks, but it also is a compliance control. So for anyone outside of the United States, that's a control. The most companies require a supervisor to review and approve an expense report. That supervisor's signature is a control. And then once it gets to accounts payable or finance, whatever group inside your company pays employee expense reimbursements, that is yet another control. What you probably have not done is map those steps that I've just articulated to a compliance control. They're certainly mapped to your SOX 404 accounting control reporting. But you may sit down with your internal control folks, whether they be in audit or whether they be in finance, and understand the internal controls that are already in place. You may know a lot of them. You may have been subject to them. Certainly, if you are, if as a compliance practitioner you've traveled overseas, if you've taken out a foreign governmental official, that needs to be noted. But you may not have mapped that to a compliance control, and that's an exercise that you can go through as well. The on your third parties, once again, you don't have to audit your third parties, but you can certainly test your third parties. So, for instance, for your high-risk third parties, you probably should be requiring some form of training, whether that's training that you put on or whether that's training that they obtain and purchase and then implement or put on themselves. Take a look at that training. If it's a DVD, if it's online, if it's a video, assess that training and then require documentation of the third parties of the delivery of that training and who was there. You might even go to the next step and require some sort of testing. But this would, of the training, to see if there was retention of that training. You might just do spot checks on your own files. Are all of the documents required under your third-party management program there? So, for instance, if you take the Tom Fox 5-step approach, is there a business justification? Was that business justification signed by the business unit sponsor and it was attested to or further approved by the head of marketing or head of sales or that employee supervisor? Second, is there a completed questionnaire that's signed and attested to by the proposed third party? Is there due diligence in the file? Was that due diligence analyzed in any way so that there's some write-up of that due diligence? Is there a contract in the file? Does that contract have compliance terms and conditions? And then has that third party been managed going forward? So if there's a requirement for an annual certification or an annual acknowledgement of training, are those in the file? Is the training documentation in the file? Are there any other meetings between the business sponsor that are documented in the file if those are required? So these are things that you can do as the compliance practitioner to test your third-party program. Obviously, it's not a forensic audit. It's not intended to be a forensic audit, so please do not think simply because you're a lawyer you have to engage in a forensic audit. But these are things that you can do yourself without really an additional headcount. An area that may not seem as obvious, though, but I think is going to become more important from the compliance perspective is employee separations. Here in Houston, it's been a very large number of layoffs. And when you have a large number of layoffs, you tend to have a large number of employment-related claims, discrimination of whatever way, shape, or form. But you may need to think about those from the compliance perspective. And one of the key things is that you treat employees with respect when they leave. So did you sit down and talk to them? Did they receive all of the benefits that they were entitled to? Have you changed your benefit or separations package because of the downturn? If you have, and reduced benefits from what they were in 2014, that's probably going to lead to lots of claims. You need to look at your hotline. Have any of the employees listed for or scheduled for termination, have they filed hotline complaints? Could there be a claim of retaliation? What happens if there's a large number of hotline claims immediately before a employment separation date that you've got announced or upcoming? You have to have a way to triage those quickly and efficiently because if there's any whiff that someone was fired because of retaliation, you could be in significant trouble with the Securities and Exchange Commission. And if they have information about a claim or potential claim and they have not disclosed that and they report that to the Securities and Exchange Commission, you may be in for a twofer. That brings up the recent KBR SEC settlement. In that case, KBR sustained a fine for having language in their confidentiality agreements. Now, this was not related to employment separation, but was related to in-house investigations, that an employee could not go to anyone outside the company without going through the KBR Law Department. The SEC held that that was a violation of the Dodd-Frank Act. It was essentially pre-retaliation because it was threatening an employee with a potential breach of contract lawsuit if they went to the SEC for any whistleblower allegations under Dodd-Frank, and of course that includes the FCPA. Well, the settlement provided specific language that KBR inserted into their confidentiality agreements with employees, and that information language was approved by the SEC in the cease and desist order. So it's something that I would suggest that you incorporate immediately into your confidentiality agreements with your employees for ongoing investigation, certainly, but also at the pre-employment stage, when they come on board stage, and certainly in the employment separation stage. If you need a copy of that, just shoot me an email, and I'm happy to share that with you. But from the compliance practitioner, have you done an exit interview? Did you ask the employee if they know anything? And have you documented that exit interview so that if they come up later, you can at least say, well, we asked them and they didn't tell us about it. So there are lots of things you can do. And in the employment separation area, I think there's lots of potential pitfalls and minefields that are not present when the economy is more sound or indeed even booming. And you may need to reprioritize some of your scarce compliance functions to take as close a look as you can at whistleblower and hotline claims as much. So these are some of the things that you can do. And really the last thing I might suggest is that when the cycle or the budget stops dropping so dramatically and starts to level out or even increase a little bit, perhaps in Q2, hopefully, but maybe in Q3 or Q4 of this year, then this might be a time where you can get some funding for a technological solution for ongoing monitoring. I think most compliance practitioners understand that ongoing monitoring is a critical part of any best practices compliance program, and indeed the 10 hallmarks of an effective compliance program, hallmark number 10, talks about ongoing monitoring. So it's something that you need to have in place, and if your headcount is reduced and yet you can monitor a large amount of financial or other data, which might be employee expense reimbursements, which might be third-party vendor billing, really limited only by your imagination. If you can review that quickly and efficiently through either a software product or software as a solution or a third-party vendor who might come in and do this for you, it may give you a way to get a handle on things that don't require an increase in headcount. They may require an increase in some budget. And the beauty of this is when things finally do turn around, that you will have this technological solution in place and you will actually be somewhat leaner, but certainly more mean when it comes to performing ongoing monitoring and be in a position to more effectively monitor these gaps going forward. And of course, at that point, you may have resources for auditing, where if a red flag pops up, you can take a deeper dive into it. But even if you don't have the funds for auditing, if you can do some sort of ongoing transaction monitoring, this may give you a way to do some additional testing. The other thing that I might suggest you consider is your training. I've heard some companies consider going to a biennial training as opposed to an annual training. That's certainly something that you can consider, but while you're doing that, you may want to assess who are my high-risk employees, and should I maybe deliver to them extra training because, frankly, they're going to be under extra pressure to sell. So one of the effects of the downturn is that there are less employees, and the employees that are still there are required to sell as much, if not more, because of the drop in prices and customers not buying your products or services. So you may want to deliver additional reminder training. You may want to actually get out of the office and go do some live training. You may want to figure out who is at higher risk now than they were previously and move forward to deliver to them some additional training. So these are some of the things that I wanted to visit with you about. I'm certainly happy to provide more information on these. I've written about some of the things you can do. You can check out my blog, the FCPA Compliance and Ethics blog, where I talk about these, and I'm going to be writing about these in greater length going forward. If you have any questions, you can contact me at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. This is Tom Fox, and thank you very much for attending this week's podcast.